Three brothers lost everything, then found a door their father carved into the cliff. Ezra Bell, who had survived 11 Nebraska winters and buried a wife, told them, "I will bury all three of you before thaw." They had $26, three brothers alone, and no way to raise shelter in time. On January 12, 1888, the temperature dropped 60 degrees in 8 hours. But 4 months earlier, Eli Mercer had never braced a roof or drafted a hearth. He had arrived at his father's homestead claim in the creek-cut country south of Scotts Bluff in the spring of 1883, a boy of 15 walking beside a wagon that carried everything the Mercer family owned. Now he was 19, and the wagon was ash. The cabin was ash. The barn was ash. And his father was in the ground beside the creek where cottonwood still stood because the fire had jumped the water. Eli Mercer stood in what had been the dooryard and counted what remained. 1 mule. The animal had been downstream when the fire came, drinking at a bend where the grass was already grazed short. It had survived by accident. A bent iron kettle. The handle had warped in the heat, but the belly held water. 2 quilts. His mother had sewn them before the fever took her in 1885. They smelled of smoke now, but the stitching held. A crate of jars, half of them cracked. Tomatoes his father had put up in September, some still sealed, others leaking pale juice into the straw packing. A sack of cornmeal, the outer layerite with smoke, but the center still good if you sifted carefully. His father's Bible tin. The pages inside were untouched. Eli did not open it. 1 box of hand tools. A hammer with a loose head. A saw missing 3 teeth. 2 chisels. An awl. A brace with no bits. The bits had been in the cabin. His brothers stood behind him. Owen was 16, quick and watchful, the one who could gentle a spooked horse and read a trap line by the way the grass bent. Ben was 12, still soft in the face, still young enough to cry when he thought no one could hear. The fire had come in late autumn, when the grass was cured and the wind shifted without warning. Prairie fires move faster than a man could run. The Mercers had been lucky, if you could call it that. The cabin had gone first, then the lean-to stable, then the rack where the tools hung. They had saved what they could carry in the minutes between seeing smoke and seeing flame. Their father had survived the fire. He had not survived what followed. Matthew Mercer was 48 years old and had lungs that had never fully healed from the war. He had spent weeks after the fire sleeping in smoke, working half frozen to salvage posts and harness from the wreckage, coughing until his handkerchief came away pink. The lung fever set in before the first real snow. He lasted until 4 days before Christmas, then stopped breathing in the night while Eli sat beside him counting the gaps between each rattling inhale. They buried him in frozen ground. Eli swung the pick until his palm split and Owen took over. Ben stood at the edge of the hole and did not speak. The grave was shallow because the frost went deep, but they piled stones on top to keep the animals out. That was 17 days ago. Now Eli stood in the ash and tried to calculate whether his brothers would live to see spring. The arithmetic was simple. The answer was no. They had $26 in coin, found in a tobacco tin his father had hidden under a hearthstone that no longer existed. It was more money than Eli had ever held, and it was not enough. The nearest settlement with a proper store was 14 miles east, a cluster of buildings that called itself a town because it had a post office and a blacksmith. Lumber there cost more than Eli could pay. Even if he could afford the boards, he could not haul them. 1 mule could not pull a loaded wagon through winter mud, and the Mercers no longer had a wagon. A sod house was possible. Men built them on the plains when they had nothing else. But sod construction required cutting bricks from the prairie in careful rows, stacking them while the ground was workable, framing a roof with timbers they did not have. It was autumn work. The ground was now frozen. The time had passed. A dugout was faster, a hole cut into a hillside, roofed with whatever poles you could find, chinked with mud and grass. Men had wintered in worse, but a proper dugout still needed a frame, needed a stove or a stone hearth, needed weeks of labor that 3 boys with 1 mule and half a set of tools could not complete before the true cold came. Eli knew these things because his father had explained them over 4 years of building. Matthew Mercer had not been a fast worker, but he had been a thorough one. He had cut and squared the cabin logs himself, one at a time, hauling them from the creek bottoms where cottonwoods grew thick enough to provide timber. It had taken 2 years to raise walls and a roof. It had taken another year to finish the floor and the chimney. The fire had undone all of it in an afternoon. Owen came to stand beside Eli. His breath fogged in the cold. "How long do we have?" Eli did not answer immediately. He was looking at the sky, trying to read it the way his father had taught him. The clouds were high and thin, moving fast from the northwest. That meant wind coming. Wind meant cold. "Weeks," Eli said finally. "Maybe less." "Until what?" "Until the kind of cold that kills." Ezra Bell arrived 3 days later. Eli heard the horse before he saw it, the creak of saddle leather, and the heavy breathing of an animal that had been ridden hard. He came out of the half-shelter they had rigged from salvaged boards and a canvas scrap to find a man dismounting in the dooryard. Bell was 62 years old and looked older. His face was weathered to the color of old leather, creased with lines that deepened when he squinted, which was always. He had been on the Nebraska plains since before the railroad came through, had buried a wife in the winter of '73, and 2 hired hands the same year when a blizzard caught them between the barn and the house. 11 winters. That was what people said about Ezra Bell. He had survived 11 Nebraska winters on open ground, and he had learned to read the signs the way other men read newspapers. He did not greet Eli. He walked past him and into the remains of the Mercer claim, his boots crunching on frozen ash. He stopped at the foundation stones where the cabin had stood. He looked at the pile of salvaged wood, the pitiful stack of supplies, the single mule standing hip-shot in a makeshift corral. Then he turned and looked at Eli's brothers, who had come out to see who had arrived. 3 of you, Bell said. It was not a question. Yes, sir. And your father gone? Yes, sir. Bell walked the perimeter of the claim. He kicked at a charred beam, tested the weight of a half-burned post. He looked at the creek, at the bluff rising above it, at the scattered cottonwoods along the water. He spent a long time looking at the sky. When he came back, his face was set in the expression Eli would come to know well, the look of a man delivering a verdict he did not enjoy giving. You have maybe 1.5 cords of usable wood in that pile, Bell said, counting the posts and the beams that didn't burn through. Maybe less. I counted closer to 2, Eli said. You counted wrong. Half of what you're looking at is too charred to burn clean. It'll smoke you out before it warms you. The good wood, the stuff that'll actually keep a fire, is about 1.5 cords. Maybe 1 3/4 if you're lucky. Eli felt something cold settle in his chest that had nothing to do with the weather. How much do we need? Bell laughed. It was not a kind sound. To winter 3 boys in a proper shelter? 6 cords minimum, 8 to be safe. Your father knew that. Every man on this stretch of the creek knows that. We can cut more. There are cottonwoods. Green cottonwood burns like wet rope. It'll smoke, it'll spit, it'll give you half the heat of seasoned wood and twice the trouble. You needed to cut your winter wood in spring and let it dry all summer. That's what your father did. That's what every man who survives out here does. Bell pointed at the ash pile that had been the Mercer woodshed. That was your winter wood. 6 cords, maybe 7. All of it gone. Owen stepped forward. We can build a shelter, a dugout. Our father showed us. Your father showed you when the ground was soft and he was alive to do the heavy work. The ground is frozen now. You'd need a pick and a bar and weeks of labor just to cut a hole big enough to sleep in. Never mind frame a roof or build a hearth. You don't have weeks, you have days. Maybe 2 weeks if the weather holds, and the weather won't hold. Bell looked at the 3 of them, Eli with his jaw set, Owen with his fists clenched, Ben with his eyes too bright. If you boys stay on this claim with no roof worth the name and no wood stacked to the ridgepole, Bell said, I will bury all 3 of you before thaw. The words hung in the cold air. You don't know that, Eli said. I know this prairie. I know what it does to men who aren't prepared. I buried my wife because a storm came faster than we expected, and the fire went out in the night. I buried 2 hired hands because they went to check the stock and couldn't find their way back through 50 feet of blowing snow. 11 winters, boy. I've seen what happens to people who think wanting to live is the same as being able to. He mounted his horse. There are families that would take you in. Split up, 1 boy per household, you'd make it through. The Pritchards could use help. The Crosses have a spare room now that their oldest is gone. You'd work for your keep, but you'd keep living. This is our father's claim, Eli said. We've been here 4 years. We're close to final proof. Final proof doesn't matter if you're dead. The Homestead Act says 5 years of residence and improvement. It doesn't say anything about freezing to death on principle. Eli did not look at his brothers. He could feel them waiting for him to answer. We're not leaving, he said. Bell studied him for a long moment. Then he shook his head. Then I'll come back in spring, he said, and I'll bury what's left of you next to your father. He rode east without looking back. That night, Eli could not sleep. He lay in the half-shelter with his brothers on either side of him, their bodies close for warmth, and listened to the wind testing the canvas above their heads. The temperature had dropped since Bell's visit. He could feel it in the way the air bit at his exposed face, in the way the frost crept closer to their bedding each night. Bell was right. About all of it. The wood count, the frozen ground, the impossible mathematics of survival. There was no way to build a proper shelter in time. There was no way to cut enough fuel to last the winter. There was no way 3 boys with 1 mule and $26 could do what needed to be done. Eli knew this. He had done the calculations himself, scratching numbers in the ash with a stick, adding and subtracting and coming up with the same answer every time. And yet, his father had spent 4 years on this claim. 4 years of labor, of hope, of building something from nothing. He had buried his wife here in '85 and kept working. He had watched the prairie try to kill him every winter and kept working. He had coughed blood into his handkerchief and kept working until his body finally gave out. To abandon the claim now, to split the brothers among strangers and let the land go back to the government, would mean that all of it had been for nothing. Matthew Mercer would have lived and died for a hole in the ground and a pile of ash. Eli could not accept that. He would not. But he also could not change the mathematics. Sometime after midnight, when the wind had died and the cold had settled into the kind of stillness that preceded the worst weather, Eli got up. He moved carefully, not wanting to wake his brothers, and stepped outside. The stars were bright and hard, scattered across a sky so black it hurt to look at. The moon was a sliver, barely enough light to see by. Eli stood in the dooryard and breathed air that burned his lungs. His father was gone. His mother was gone. Everything they had built was gone. What was left? The question nagged at him as he stood shivering in the dark. His father had been a methodical man, a planner. He had spent years building the cabin, thinking ahead, preparing for contingencies. It seemed wrong that such a man would die and leave his sons with nothing but ash and impossible mathematics. What was left? Eli went back inside. He lay down between his brothers and pulled the quilts up to his chin. He was still awake when Ben stirred beside him. Eli, go back to sleep. I found something in Pa's things. Eli turned his head. Ben's face was barely visible in the darkness, a pale smudge against the darker smudge of the bedding. What do you mean? The seed box, the one with the false bottom. There's a paper in it. Eli sat up. Show me. Ben had hidden the paper under his shirt, close to his skin. He pulled it out now, a folded square of rough paper, creased and worn. Eli took it and moved toward the canvas flap where a crack of starlight came through. It was a map, crudely drawn, barely more than a sketch, but recognizable. The creek with its bend, the bluff above it marked with rough shading to suggest height. The cottonwood stand along the water, and on the bluff face, a small square. Next to it, a single word in his father's careful handwriting. Door. Eli did not tell his brothers what he was thinking. Not yet. The map might mean nothing. A door in a cliff was not possible. Rock did not have doors. But his father had hidden the map for a reason, had drawn it carefully, labeled it clearly, tucked it into a false bottom where only someone looking for secrets would find it. The next morning, Eli left Owen to watch the camp and took Ben with him up the creek. The bluff rose above the water in layers of sandstone, soft enough to carve with hand tools, hard enough to hold its shape against wind and weather. Eli had seen the bluffs 100 times without really looking at them. They were just landscape, part of the background of a life spent working the claim below. Now he looked at them differently. Ben led the way, following the map as best he could. The sketch was simple, but the landmarks were clear: the bend in the creek, the stand of cottonwoods, the angle where the bluff face turned toward the water. "There," Ben said, pointing. At first Eli saw nothing, just rock, weathered and dusty, covered with patches of lichen. Then Ben climbed higher, brushed away a layer of grit with his bare hand, and revealed something that should not have been there. Grain. Wood grain. "It's a door," Ben said. His voice was strange, hushed. "He built a door." Eli scrambled up beside his brother. Now he could see what Ben had found: a narrow panel set flush with the stone, made of cottonwood planks weathered to the same color as the surrounding rock. The edges were concealed by the natural fissures in the sandstone. The surface had been rubbed with dust until it looked like part of the bluff. From below, from the creek or the claim, you would never see it. You would never think to look. Eli found the edge with his fingernails and pulled. The door swung outward on silent hinges. Beyond it, darkness. Eli stood at the threshold and tried to make sense of what he was seeing. An entry passage, about 4 feet wide, cut into the sandstone. He could see tool marks on the walls, chisel lines in neat rows, the work of months or years. His father had done this. His father had spent God knew how many hours carving a passage into the bluff, and he had never said a word to anyone. "Stay here," Eli told Ben. He stepped inside. The passage ran about 8 feet into the rock, turning slightly as it went. Eli moved slowly, one hand on the wall, feeling his way. The temperature changed immediately. The air was cool and still, nothing like the biting cold outside. He could smell earth and stone and something else, something faintly chemical. Then the passage opened, and Eli stood in a room carved from the living rock. The ceiling was low. He could almost touch it if he raised his hand. The walls were smooth, worked with the same careful chisel strokes as the passage. Along one side, a hearth had been built into the stone, a proper hearth with a stone-lined firebox and what looked like a flue rising into the rock above. Shelves had been pegged into the opposite wall, rough cottonwood planks loaded with shapes Eli could not identify in the darkness. He saw jars, cloth bundles, the gleam of metal. His father had built this. Not just the passage, not just the door, but a room, a shelter, a place where someone could survive. Eli's legs gave out. He sat down on the stone floor and tried to breathe. Matthew Mercer had known. He had known that the cabin could burn, that the winter could kill, that his sons might need a place where the wind could not reach them. He had spent years, it must have been years, cutting this shelter into the bluff, preparing for a future he might not live to see. And he had told no one. "Eli?" Ben's voice echoed from the passage. "What is it? What's in there?" Eli stood up. His hands were shaking. "Bring Owen," he said. "Tell him to bring a lamp." With light, the scope of what Matthew Mercer had built became clear. It was not just one room. The main chamber, 12 feet by 14, as near as Eli could measure, opened onto 2 smaller spaces. A sleeping room, about 8 by 10, with bunks cut into the wall ledge. A storeroom, smaller still, with shelves running floor to ceiling. The shelves were not empty. Eli counted as Owen held the lamp steady. Jars of preserved vegetables, beans, carrots, something that looked like squash, salt pork in a crock, packed in brine that smelled sharp and clean, dried corn in canvas sacks, a small barrel of flour, tallow candles, 2 dozen of them, lamp oil in a tin, a rolled stovepipe section, nails in a jar, wedges, awls, a maul head without a handle, and clothes, wool socks, thick and hand-knitted, a coat that had belonged to their father, mittens. How long? Owen asked. His voice was strange. How long was he working on this? Eli thought about the question. The main chamber alone must have taken hundreds of hours. The shelving, the bunks, the hearth, each one was days of labor. The food had to have been put up over multiple seasons, carried up the bluff, and stored in secret. Years, Eli said. He must have started before Ma died, maybe before any of us knew to look. Why didn't he tell us? Eli shook his head. He did not know. Maybe their father had meant to. Maybe he had been waiting until the shelter was finished. Maybe he had simply been a private man who kept his preparations to himself. It did not matter now. Can we live in it? Ben asked. Can it work? Eli walked to the hearth. The firebox was well built, the stone fitted tight, the throat rising into darkness above. But something was wrong. He could see fresh soot only halfway up the flue line. The chimney had not been completed. He turned over the map in his hands and found more of his father's writing on the back. Finish the throat. Keep the draft low. Trust the stone before the boards. He didn't finish it, Eli said. The hearth won't draw right. The smoke will fill the room. Then we finish it, Owen said. We don't know how. We'll figure it out. Eli looked at his brothers in the lamplight. Owen with his jaw set, looking so much like their father it hurt. Ben with his eyes bright, clinging to hope the way a drowning man clings to a rope. The shelter was here. The food was here. Everything they needed to survive the winter was here, waiting for them in a hole in the bluff. Everything except the one piece their father had not lived to complete. We have to tell someone, Eli said. We need help. Nora Pritchard arrived the next morning. She was 37 years old, a widow with 2 children of her own, working the claim east of the Mercers by herself since her husband had died of a ruptured appendix 2 winters past. She was practical rather than warm, the kind of woman who measured help in utility rather than sentiment. Eli had asked her to come because she was the closest neighbor and the least likely to gossip. What he found in the bluff could save his family or doom them, depending on how the community received the news. Nora stood at the entrance to the shelter and looked inside. She did not speak for a long moment. Your father built this, she said finally. Yes, ma'am. Without telling anyone. Yes, ma'am. Nora stepped into the passage, and Eli followed with the lamp. She examined the walls, the ceiling, the construction of the bunks and the shelves. She opened jars and smelled the contents. She tested the weight of the flour barrel. When she came to the hearth, she stopped. It doesn't draw, Eli said. The throat isn't finished. Nora bent and looked up into the flue. Her voice echoed when she spoke. He got it most of the way. Another foot, maybe 2, and it would pull clean, but he stopped. He got sick. He died before he could finish. Nora backed out of the hearth and stood up, brushing stone dust from her hands. She looked at Eli with an expression he could not read. You mean to live in this? She said. Yes, ma'am. We don't have another choice. You have choices. Ezra Bell told you what they were. Splitting up isn't a choice. It's giving up. Nora studied him for another moment. Then she walked back through the shelter, touching the walls as she went, running her fingers along the chisel marks. You mean to put 3 boys underground in winter, she said, with 1 choke-hole for smoke that doesn't draw right. Your roof is sandstone. Do you even know if it will hold? Have you tested for seepage? What happens if the entrance drifts shut in a blizzard? What happens if the fire goes out and you can't restart it? Each question was a blow. Eli felt them land. I don't know, he admitted. I don't know any of those things. Then how can you ask your brothers to trust their lives to this? Because there isn't anything else. Because our father built it for us. Because if we don't try, we die anyway. Nora was quiet. The hearth is the problem, she said finally. Everything else, the storage, the sleeping space, the entrance concealment, that's good work. Your father knew what he was doing. But without a working draft, you'll poison yourselves with smoke before the cold ever touches you. Can you help? I don't know stone. I know wood. I know farming. I know how to keep children alive on nothing. But masonry? She shook her head. That's specialist work. Then who does know? Nora was silent for a moment. Anton Kral, she said. The Bohemian down by the river cut. He worked the railroad blasting crews before his leg went bad. He knows stone. Will he help? I don't know. He doesn't owe you anything. He doesn't owe anyone anything. Can you ask him? Nora looked at Eli. Then she looked at the shelter around them, the food on the shelves, the bunks in the wall, the careful work of a dead man trying to save his children from beyond the grave. I'll ask, she said. But Eli, if this doesn't work, you have to promise me something. What? You send Ben to me, the youngest. If the shelter fails, if the draft can't be fixed, you send him to my house before you die. You don't take all three of you into the ground because you were too proud to admit your father's plan wasn't enough. Eli wanted to argue. He wanted to say that he would make it work, that he would find a way, that his father's preparation would be enough. But Nora's eyes were steady, and her question was fair. I promise, he said. Harlan Voss heard about the Mercer boys and their cliff shelter before the end of the week. News traveled in frontier communities the way water traveled across flat ground, slowly at first, then everywhere at once. Someone told someone else who told someone else. And by the time Eli walked into Voss's store to buy lime and lampwick and flour on partial credit, half the settlement knew what Matthew Mercer had hidden in the bluff. Voss was 44 years old, thick through the chest and thin through the smile. He ran the only general store in 14 miles and held credit accounts on half the homesteaders in the area. When a family failed, when a claim was abandoned, or a homesteader died without heirs, Voss was usually there to buy what was left at pennies on the dollar. He looked up when Eli entered the store. The Mercer boy, he said, the one who found a palace in the rock. Eli ignored the tone. I need lime, 20 pounds if you have it, and lampwick, and flour, whatever you can spare on account. Voss leaned against the counter. He made no move toward the shelves. Heard your father was a busy man, building a whole house inside the bluff without telling anyone. A man like that must have had secrets. He was preparing for trouble. That's not a secret. That's sense. Is that what you call it? Voss smiled. The way I heard it, you boys found a hole in the ground with some jars in it, not exactly a palace. I didn't say it was a palace. No, the stories say that. The stories say your father carved out rooms with furniture and food enough for a year. The stories say you think you can winter there instead of breaking up the family like sensible folk. Eli's jaw tightened. I need the supplies, Mr. Voss. I have coin, and I'll pay what I can't cover come spring. Voss sucked his teeth. Behind him, through the doorway that led to the back room, Eli could see Ezra Bell sitting at a table with a cup of coffee. Bell's eyes met his. The old man did not look away. Thing about credit, Voss said, is that it requires a reasonable expectation of repayment. If I extend you credit and you die before thaw, I'm left holding the account, and dead boys don't settle their debts. We're not going to die. Ezra there says different. Says he gave you the arithmetic himself. Says you've got a cord and a half of wood, no shelter worth the name, and 3 weeks before the kind of cold that freezes cattle standing up. That was before we found the shelter. A hole in a cliff is not a shelter. Voss's smile widened. It is where a family goes when it has run out of choices, when it has given up on doing things properly and decided to die slowly instead of quickly. Someone else might have swung at Voss then. Eli thought about it, but hitting the only storekeeper in 14 miles would not buy supplies, and supplies were what his brothers needed. Full credit, no, Voss said. But I'll sell you the lime and the wick at cash price, and I'll give you 5 pounds of flour on account, not the 20 you want, 5, and we'll see if you're still breathing in January. It was an insult disguised as generosity. Eli knew it. Voss knew he knew it. Fine, Eli said. He paid for what he could and accepted the grudging charity for the rest. As he gathered his supplies, He heard Voss call after him. "If your dead father built you a palace in the bluff," Voss said, "pay from the palace." Eli did not look back. Outside, the sky was gray and low. The temperature had dropped again. Eli could feel it in the way the wind cut through his coat, in the way the mud had frozen into ridges that caught at his boots. He loaded the supplies onto the mule and started the long walk home. Behind him, in the store, he heard Voss laughing. Anton Krall came to the Mercer claim on the first day of December. Eli heard him before he saw him, a slow, uneven rhythm of footsteps, one heavy and one dragging, moving through the dead grass toward the bluff. He came out of the shelter entrance with a chisel in his hand and saw a man limping toward him through the gray afternoon light. Krall was 58 years old and looked it. His hair was gray, cut short, and his beard was the same color, trimmed close against cheeks that wind had roughened over years of outdoor labor. He walked with a cane that he had made himself, hickory worn smooth by use, and his left leg swung out and around with each step instead of bending at the knee. He stopped 10 feet from Eli and looked up at the bluff face. "The widow Pritchard said you had something worth seeing," he said. His accent was thick, the vowels shaped by a language Eli did not speak. "She said your father cut a hole in the rock, and you are trying to finish it." "Yes, sir." "Show me." Eli led him up the slope to the entrance. Krall climbed slowly, his cane finding purchase on the frozen ground, his bad leg dragging behind him. At the door, he stopped and ran his hand along the frame. "Cottonwood," he said, "weathered to match the stone. Clever." Inside, Krall's examination was thorough and silent. He touched the walls. He measured the ceiling with his eyes. He bent to study the hearth, his bad legs straight out behind him, and looked up into the flue for a long time. When he emerged from the firebox, his face was thoughtful. "Your father did this work," he said. "Yes, sir." "How many years?" Eli shook his head. "I don't know, he never told us. We found the map after he died." "He worked alone?" "As far as I know." Krall walked through the shelter again, slower this time, stopping at the bunks and the shelves, examining the way the stone had been cut to create level surfaces. "I knew your father," he said finally. "We traded work 2 summers ago. He helped me set fence posts when my leg was bad. I showed him how to line a well with dry stone." Eli waited. He asked me questions about hearth construction, about how to make a throat draw properly in a confined space. I thought he was planning to rebuild his cabin chimney. I did not know. Krall gestured at the shelter around them. I did not know he was doing this. "Can you help us finish it?" Krall was quiet for a long moment. "The widow said you have 2 brothers, younger than you." "Yes, sir. Owen is 16, Ben is 12. "And you will not leave the claim?" "No, sir." Even though the sensible thing would be to split the family and survive the winter with others. Eli's jaw tightened. "This is our father's land. He died building something that would last. If we leave now, all of it was for nothing." Krall studied him. Eli could not read his expression. "Most men would have quit after the first chamber," Krall said. "Cutting stone is slow work. Your hands crack, your arms ache, your eyes burn from the dust. And you do it in secret after the day's real work is done, without knowing if you will live to see it finished." He looked at the tool marks on the walls, the careful rows of chisel strikes. "Your father did not give up. He kept cutting until his body failed him. That is not nothing, boy. That is something very few men have." "Then help us," Eli said. Krall's mouth twisted into something that was almost a smile. "I'm not charity," he said. "I do not help people because they ask. I help people because they are worth helping. Do you understand the difference?" Eli thought about it. "I think so." "I watched you ask the widow for help. She said you did not beg. You did not make excuses. You looked at the problem and asked who could solve it. That is competence. Competence I can work with." He turned back toward the entrance. "Come tomorrow at first light. Bring your brothers. Bring what tools you have. We start with the throat." The work began on the 2nd of December. Krall's teaching was not gentle, but it was clear. He did not lecture. He showed, and he expected Eli to watch and remember. The throat of a hearth, he explained, was everything. If the throat was too wide, smoke would roll back into the room, too narrow, and the draft would whistle and suck heat up the chimney instead of into the living space. The angle mattered. The smoothness of the interior walls mattered. The relationship between the firebox and the flue mattered. Matthew Mercer had gotten it mostly right. The stone was well cut, the proportions reasonable, but he had stopped before the throat narrowed properly, and the flue rose at a slight angle that would cause trouble when the wind blew from certain directions. Your father understood the principle, Krall said, but he did not have experience. He learned from books, maybe, or from watching other men. That is not the same as doing it yourself 100 times. The fix was delicate work. Eli and Owen cut stones to Krall's specifications, small pieces, precisely shaped, meant to narrow the throat in stages. They fitted them with clay mortar that Krall showed them how to mix, packing it into the gaps until no air could pass except through the proper channel. It was slow. Days of labor for inches of progress. But on the 5th day, Krall built a test fire in the hearth. Eli watched the smoke rise, tentative at first, curling at the edges of the firebox, then catching the draft and pulling upward. The flames steadied. The room did not fill with smoke. Good, Krall said. Not perfect, but good. While Eli worked on the hearth, Owen and Ben worked on everything else. Krall taught Owen to sound the sandstone ceiling with hammer taps, listening for hollow zones where the rock might shear and fall. He marked the weak spots with chalk and showed Owen how to set cottonwood lintels beneath them, bracing the stone before it could collapse. Ben learned to trench a shallow drainage line outside the entrance, directing snowmelt and rain away from the door. He learned to seal the door jamb with layers of felt, rag, and clay so the wind could not whistle through the cracks. They worked from first light until the sun went down, then worked by lamplight until their eyes would not focus anymore. Eli's hands cracked and bled. Owen's shoulders ached from hauling stone. Ben's fingers turned red and raw from packing clay into crevices. But the shelter improved. By the end of the 2nd week, the hearth drew cleanly. The ceiling was braced at 6 points. The door sealed tight. The drainage trench ran away from the entrance in a proper slope. Progress markers. Week 1, main room cleared, throat rebuilding begun. Week 2, first successful test burn, lintels placed, drainage trenched. Eli kept count because he needed to see progress, because without progress, the calendar became a countdown to death. On the 16th day of December, the first lintel cracked. Eli heard it before he saw it, a sound like a gunshot, sharp and sudden, coming from the ceiling above the sleeping room. He grabbed Ben and pulled him back just as a chunk of sandstone the size of a man's head broke free and crashed to the floor. The lintel beneath it had split down the middle. Not from pressure, the stone above was still holding, but from a flaw in the wood that no one had seen. A crack that had been there all along, hidden inside the grain, waiting for the cold to contract the fibers until the tension became too much. Owen stood in the doorway, his face white. Is anyone hurt? No, Eli said. His voice was steady, but his hands were shaking. Ben, are you hurt? Ben shook his head. He was staring at the stone on the floor, at the cavity in the ceiling where it had broken free. The lintel failed, Eli said. We need to replace it. With what? Owen asked. We used all the good cottonwood for the first set. Eli looked at the fallen rock, at the cracked beam, at the ceiling that suddenly seemed much more fragile than it had that morning. They had 2 weeks until January. The weather had been holding, cold but clear. No major storms, but that could not last. When the blizzards came, they would be trapped inside the shelter with a ceiling that might or might not hold, and a heating system that might or might not work. We cut more, Eli said. There are cottonwoods by the creek. We find a trunk that's straight enough. We cut it, we haul it up here. In this cold, the wood will be frozen through. Then we thaw it. We build a fire next to it. We do whatever we have to do. Owen's jaw tightened, but he did not argue. They worked through the night. The mule slipped on the creek ice the next day. It was not a bad fall. The animal went down on one haunch and came up lame, favoring its right front shoulder, but it was enough. The mule was their only draft animal. Without it, they could not haul the new lintel up the slope to the shelter. Without the lintel, the ceiling would remain compromised. Eli stood in the frozen creek bed and wanted to scream. Everything they had was tied to this animal. One mule, bent and bruised and now limping. If it broke a leg, if the injury worsened, they would lose their only way to move heavy loads. Owen ran his hands along the shoulder, feeling for breaks. "Not serious," he said finally. "Strained, maybe, bruised. If we rest it for a few days." "We don't have a few days." "Then we carry the lintel ourselves." Eli looked at the cottonwood trunk they had cut that morning. It was 8 feet long and thick as a man's thigh. He could not lift one end by himself, let alone carry it up a slope. "We can't." "Then we drag it. We rig a rope harness. We put our backs into it. We drag it." Eli stared at his brother. Owen stared back. "We don't have another choice," Owen said. They rigged the harness. They dragged the lintel. It took 4 hours to cover a distance the mule could have managed in 20 minutes. By the time they reached the shelter, Eli's back was a single continuous ache and his hands were bleeding through his mittens. But the lintel was in place by nightfall. Nora Pritchard came on Christmas Eve. She did not knock. The door was sealed against the cold, and no one inside would hear knocking over the wind. Instead, she called out from the base of the slope, and Ben scrambled down to lead her up. She carried a bundle wrapped in canvas. Inside were 2 sacks of onions, small and half-dried, and a roll of wool so old it had lost its color. "For the boys," she said, handing the bundle to Eli. "The wool can stuff your bedding. The onions will keep scurvy away." Eli did not know what to say. They had nothing to give in return, but Nora was already turning away. "Ben gave me one of your father's spare awls," she said, "before you found the shelter. He said it was trade." Eli looked at his youngest brother. Ben's face was flushed, but his chin was up. "I thought she might need it more than we did. I didn't know about." He gestured at the shelter behind them. Nora's mouth twitched. "He has good instincts, your brother. Don't let the winter take that away from him." She left without looking back. The fire burned steady on Christmas night. The smoke pulled true through the rebuilt throat. Outside, the temperature dropped toward 0, but inside the shelter, the air was warm enough that Eli's breath did not fog. Owen opened one of the jars from the storeroom, preserved peaches, put up by their father in some summer that now seemed impossibly far away, and they passed it between them, each taking a slice with fingers that were finally, for once, not numb with cold. "He knew," Ben said softly. "Pa knew we might need this." "He knew," Eli agreed. The peaches were sweet and soft, the syrup thick and golden. Eli let the taste sit on his tongue and thought about his father working alone in the dark, chiseling stone by lamplight, preparing for a future he might not live to see. Anton Krall had said it was something very few men have. He was right. But the shelter was not finished. The throat was fixed, but the winter was not over. The lintel was replaced, but the ceiling had failed once and might fail again. The supplies were stocked, but they were finite, and the calendar was only beginning. January was coming, and January on the Nebraska plains was when the real cold arrived. That night, lying in the bunk his father had carved from stone, Eli thought about Ezra Bell's words. "I will bury all 3 of you before thaw." The shelter answered the impossible arithmetic. It gave them walls that would not burn, warmth that did not depend on stacks of seasoned wood, food that would last through the worst of the winter. But a shelter was not a guarantee. It was a chance. Bell had buried his wife and 2 hired hands because the frontier did not care about preparation, because cold and wind and snow did not negotiate with human intention. Eli's father had built something remarkable, but he had died before he could see if it would work. Now Eli had to finish what his father started. He had to keep his brothers alive until spring. He had to prove that the years of secret labor had meant something. Outside, the wind rose. Eli listened to it test the door, probe the seams, search for a way inside. It found nothing, for now. The new year arrived without ceremony. Eli marked it only because Ben had scratched the date into the soft stone near his bunk, January 1st, 1888, and because the temperature dropped hard that morning, as if the calendar itself had turned a page into something colder and more serious. Anton Kral came to the shelter less often now. His leg worsened in the deep cold, the old injury from the railroad blasting crews seizing up until some days he could not walk at all. But when he came, he taught. "The stone remembers heat," he said one afternoon, standing by the hearth with his hands extended toward the flames. "You warm it slowly day after day, and it holds that warmth even when the fire dies. But you must be patient. You cannot rush stone." Eli nodded. He had noticed this already. The walls of the main chamber had begun to feel different, less cold to the touch, as if the weeks of careful fires had soaked into the rock itself. "Your father understood this," Kral continued. "That is why he cut deep. A surface shelter, a lean-to or a tent, loses heat as fast as you make it. But a room inside the earth itself becomes your insulation." He never told us any of this. No. He learned by watching, by asking questions, by trying and failing, the way all men learn. Kral shifted his weight off his bad leg. He asked me once about the railroad cuts, how we kept the crews alive when we worked through winter. I told him about the warming tents we built against the rock faces, how the stone would hold heat better than any canvas. He listened very carefully. "You taught him." "I gave him pieces. He built the whole from pieces." Kral looked around the chamber. "This is not my work. This is his work, informed by many sources. That is how knowledge moves from hand to hand, mouth to mouth, each man adding something until the thing becomes real." The second week of January brought a different kind of lesson. Kral arrived at dawn with a bundle of tools Eli had never seen, long iron rods with flattened ends, a small hammer with a head shaped like a wedge, a leather pouch filled with clay that had been mixed with something that smelled sharp and mineral. "Today you learn to read the ceiling," he said. They spent the morning sounding the stone. Kral showed Eli how to tap with the hammer, how to listen for the difference between solid rock and hollow spots where water had eaten away the stone from within. He showed him how to feel the vibration through the handle, how to mark the weak points with chalk, how to judge which areas needed bracing and which would hold on their own. "Your father braced 6 points," Kral said. "That was good, but he missed 2. He marked the spots with X's. Here and here, you feel how the sound changes?" Eli tapped where Kral indicated. The ring was different, duller, with a faint echo beneath it. "Hollow?" "Not hollow. Fractured. The stone is cracked inside where you cannot see. Eventually the crack will spread. Eventually that section will fall." "How long?" "Years, maybe. Or months. Or the next time the temperature drops hard and the stone contracts around the fracture." Kral handed Eli one of the iron rods. "We brace it now, while we have time." They worked through the day. Owen hauled stone for the new supports, while Ben mixed mortar under Kral's direction. By nightfall, 2 new lintels were in place, and the ceiling was as secure as they could make it. Eli's arms ached, his back ached, but the shelter was stronger than it had been that morning. "You are learning," Kral said as he prepared to leave. "Slowly, but you are learning." "Will it be enough?" Kral paused at the entrance. The wind outside was rising, carrying the smell of snow. "I do not know," he said. "No one knows until the test comes. That is the truth of preparation. You do the work, you make the choices, and then you wait to see if you were right." He limped down the slope into the gathering dark. Ezra Bell returned on the 9th of January. Eli heard the horse and went out to meet him, expecting another verdict, another warning, another reminder of the mathematics that said the Mercer boys could not survive. But Bell's face was different this time, less certain, less ready to pronounce judgment. "The widow Pritchard told me what you've been doing. he said without dismounting. The Bohemian, too. They say your father left you something more than a hole in the ground. He did. Show me. Eli led him up the slope to the shelter entrance. Bell dismounted and tied his horse to a cottonwood branch, then followed Eli through the door. Inside, he stood for a long time without speaking. The hearth was lit, burning low and steady. The main chamber was warm, not hot, but warm enough that Eli had shed his coat. The shelves were stocked with jars and sacks, neatly organized. The bunks in the sleeping room were made up with quilts and the wool Nora had brought. Bell walked the perimeter. He touched the walls. He bent to examine the hearth-throat, just as Kral had done weeks earlier. Your father built this, he said finally. Yes, sir. How many years? We don't know. We think he started before my mother died. Bell was quiet. The throat is good, he said. Better than good. It draws clean, even with the entrance open. The Bohemian helped us finish it. My father died before he could complete the draft. Kral. Bell nodded. He knows stone. Worked the railroad cuts before his leg went. Yes, sir. Bell straightened up and looked at Eli. His face was still hard, still weathered with 11 winters of learning what the prairie could do. But something in his eyes had shifted. I told you I'd bury all 3 of you before thaw, he said. I remember. I meant it when I said it. The arithmetic was clear. No shelter, no wood, no way to build in time. Bell looked around the chamber again. This changes the arithmetic. Eli felt something loosen in his chest. But it doesn't guarantee anything, Bell continued. A shelter is not survival. A shelter is a chance at survival. The blizzards haven't come yet, not the real ones. When they do, we'll see if your father's work holds. It will hold. You don't know that. No, but I believe it. Bell studied him for a moment. Your father was like that too, he said. Quiet, stubborn, certain of things he had no right to be certain of. He moved toward the entrance. I was wrong about the arithmetic. I'm not ready to say I was wrong about the rest. He paused at the door. There's weather coming, a week, maybe less. The signs are all wrong, warm days when there should be cold, wind from the south when it should blow from the north. When the change comes, it will come hard. We'll be ready. Maybe. Bell pulled his coat tighter. Or maybe I'll be back in spring to bury you after all. He rode away without looking back. The warm spell that Bell had warned about arrived on January 10th. Eli woke that morning to a sound he had not heard in weeks, the drip of water. The temperature had risen overnight, climbing from well below 0 to something that felt almost mild. Snow softened on the slopes. Ice crackled and loosened along the creek. The sun, when it appeared, was warm enough that Eli could work outside without gloves. Owen came out of the shelter squinting. What's happening? Thaw, Eli said. A false thaw. Bell warned me about this. Warned you? He said when the change comes, it will come hard. The warm weather doesn't mean the winter's over. It means the winter is gathering itself. Owen looked at the sky, blue and clear and impossibly gentle. When? He said a week, maybe less. They spent the thaw preparing. Eli checked every seal on the shelter entrance, packing fresh clay into gaps that had opened as the temperature shifted. Owen hauled water from the creek and filled every container they had, jars, the kettle, a bucket they had salvaged from the wreckage of the barn. If the blizzard buried them, if they could not get out for days, they would need water inside. Ben reorganized the food stores, counting jars and measuring flour, calculating how long they could last if they could not leave the shelter at all. 3 weeks, he reported. Maybe 4 if we're careful. The salt pork will last longest. The flour will run out first. Then we rationed the flour. I already started. Eli looked at his youngest brother. Ben was 12 years old, still soft in the face, but his eyes had changed over the past months. There was a sharpness there now, a practicality that had not existed before. You're doing good work, Eli said. Ben shrugged. Pa would have done it better. Pa isn't here. You are. On January 11th, the wind shifted. Eli felt it before he understood it, a change in the air, a pressure against his ears that had not been there that morning. He stepped outside the shelter entrance and looked northwest, toward the horizon. The sky was still blue overhead. But at the edge of the world where the plains met the heavens, something dark was building. Owen came up beside him. That doesn't look right. No. How long? Eli watched the dark line on the horizon. It was not moving fast, not yet, but it was spreading, eating the blue sky from the bottom up. Tomorrow, he said. Maybe tonight. Should we bring the mule up? Eli thought about it. The mule was in a makeshift pen down by the creek, sheltered by a windbreak of salvaged boards. If they brought it up to the bluff, it would be closer to the shelter, but there was no way to get a mule inside the entrance passage. We can't bring it in with us, Eli said. If the storm is bad enough, it won't matter where the mule is. We can't just leave it. We might have to. Owen's face tightened, but he did not argue. They both knew the mathematics. 3 brothers could fit in the shelter. A mule could not. The morning of January 12th dawned warm. Eli came out of the shelter at first light and stood in air that felt like spring. The sun was up, pale and gentle, casting long shadows across the snow. Birds were singing, actual birds, the kind that should have been gone for months, calling from the cottonwoods by the creek as if winter had never happened. It was wrong. All of it was wrong. Owen appeared beside him. I'm going to check on the mule, he said. Take a rope, tie one end here at the entrance. Owen nodded. He took the coil of hemp rope they kept by the door, tied one end to a stone outcropping, and started down the slope with the other end looped over his shoulder. Eli watched him go. The warmth was a lie. He could feel it in his bones, an instability in the air, a pressure that built with every breath. The sky was still blue, but the blue was wrong, too pale, too thin. By mid-morning, the birds had stopped singing. By noon, the wind had begun to rise. It came from the northwest, the direction Eli had been watching since the day before. It came fast, faster than he had expected, building from a whisper to a moan to a roar in the space of an hour. The temperature began to drop. Ben came to stand beside him at the entrance. Where's Owen? Eli looked toward the creek. He could see the windbreak, could see movement near the pen, but the distance was already hazy with blown snow. Getting the mule. He's been gone a long time. I know. The temperature was falling hard now. Eli could feel it against his face, the warmth bleeding out of the air as if someone had opened a door to another world. The wind brought snow with it, not falling snow, but horizontal snow, driven sideways with enough force to sting exposed skin. Owen! Eli shouted. The wind took his voice and scattered it. Owen! Nothing. Eli looked at Ben. His youngest brother's face was pale, his eyes wide. Stay here, Eli said. Do not leave the shelter. Do you understand? Where are you going? To find him. Eli grabbed the rope and started down the slope. The world had vanished. Eli had lived on the Nebraska plains for 4 years. He had seen blizzards before, walls of white, winds that cut through clothing, temperatures that froze water in minutes. But he had never seen anything like this. The snow was not falling. It was flying. The wind screamed across the open ground, picking up every loose particle and hurling it sideways with the force of flung gravel. Eli could not see his own feet. He could not see the creek, the cottonwoods, the pen where the mule had been. He could see nothing but white, endless white. A white so complete that it swallowed direction and distance and thought. He followed the rope. Hand over hand, he pulled himself along its length, his back to the wind, his eyes slitted against the driving snow. The cold was already in his bones, not the slow cold of an ordinary winter day, but a sudden violent cold that seemed to attack from all directions at once. The rope led downhill. Eli followed it. After what felt like hours, but was probably minutes, he heard a sound through the roar of the wind. An animal sound, the mule, braying with fear. Owen! This time someone answered. Here! I'm here! Eli followed the voice. The rope ran out before he reached it. Owen had gone beyond the end, into the storm without a tether. Eli let go of the rope and pushed forward, one arm raised against the wind, the other stretched out in front of him, feeling for anything solid. His hand found cloth. A coat. Owen. I've got you. The mule. Forget the mule. I can't leave it. Eli grabbed his brother by the arm and pulled. Owen resisted for a moment, then let himself be dragged. Behind them, the mule screamed into the wind. Finding the rope again was the hardest part. Eli had let go of the end, and the end was somewhere in a world that had no landmarks, no directions, nothing but white noise and white air, and a cold so deep it burned. He found it by luck. His foot caught on the coil, tripped him, and when he reached down to free himself, his hand closed on hemp. Grab on! He shouted at Owen. Don't let go. They climbed. Ben was waiting at the entrance, his face a pale smear in the white chaos of the storm. He grabbed Owen's other arm and helped drag him inside. Eli came last, pulling the door shut behind him, leaning against it while the wind shrieked and pounded on the other side. For a long moment no one spoke. The shelter was warm. The hearth was burning. The walls were solid around them, muting the roar of the storm to a distant rumble. Owen was shaking, not from fear, but from cold. His coat was crusted with ice. His eyebrows were white with frost. Get him to the fire, Eli said. They stripped off his outer layers and wrapped him in quilts. Ben heated water in the kettle and pressed a warm cup into Owen's hands. Slowly, the shaking subsided. The mule, Owen said. Gone. I almost had the lead rope. I almost had it. The mule is gone. Eli's voice was flat. There was nothing you could do. Owen closed his eyes. Outside, the wind continued to scream. The storm did not stop. Eli had expected the worst to pass in hours. That was how blizzards usually worked. A fierce assault followed by a gradual weakening, the wind dying down, the snow settling, the world becoming navigable again. This blizzard did not follow the rules. By nightfall, the temperature had dropped so far that Eli's thermometer, a cheap glass tube his father had bought in town years ago, no longer gave a reading. The mercury had sunk below the lowest mark on the scale, somewhere beyond 30, below zero. The wind was worse. It did not gust and subside. It blew constantly, a sustained pressure against the shelter entrance that made the door creak and groan. And the snow was burying them. Eli discovered this when he tried to open the door at dusk to check the drift level. The door would not move. He pushed harder. Something shifted, and a cascade of white powder spilled through the gap. Ben, he said quietly, get a shovel. They dug out the entrance by lamplight. The drift had risen 3 feet since they had closed the door that afternoon. At this rate, by morning, the entire entrance passage would be filled. We dig every 2 hours, Eli said. Through the night. If we let it build up, we won't be able to open the door at all. Owen, still wrapped in quilts by the fire, tried to stand. I'll take a shift. You'll stay where you are. I can. You almost died today. You're not recovered. Ben and I will handle the digging. Owen wanted to argue. Eli could see it in his face. But he did not have the strength, and they both knew it. 2 hours, Ben said. I'll wake you. The first night was the longest of Eli's life. He and Ben traded shifts, 2 hours of sleep, then up to dig, then back to sleep, over and over while the storm raged outside and the temperature continued to fall. Each time Eli opened the door, the drift was higher. Each time the cold that poured in was more vicious than before. At 3 a.m, the fire began to backpuff. Eli was half asleep when it happened, a cough from the hearth, a curl of smoke rolling out into the room instead of up the chimney. He sat up, instantly alert. The draft, he said. Ben was awake too, his eyes watering from the smoke. What's wrong with it? Eli went to the hearth and looked up into the throat. The smoke was curling, uncertain, rising a few feet and then folding back on itself. The draft that had pulled clean for weeks was failing. "The pressure outside," Eli said. "The wind is so strong it's pushing air down the chimney." "What do we do?" Eli thought about what Crawl had taught him: the throat, the draft, the relationship between inside and outside air. If the pressure outside was greater than the pressure inside, the smoke would not rise. "We lower the fire," he said, "and we open a gap at the damper, just a crack, enough to relieve the pressure." He made the adjustments with hands that were not entirely steady. The smoke continued to curl for a long, terrifying moment. Then the draft caught, and the smoke began to rise again. "Is it fixed?" Ben asked. "For now. But if the wind gets worse—" He did not finish the sentence. By morning, Owen had developed a cough. It was not the same cough their father had died from. Eli told himself that over and over, but it was a cough nonetheless, wet and rattling, deep in the chest. "It's nothing," Owen said between fits. "Just the cold air. You need to stay warm." "I am warm." But he was not. Despite the fire, despite the quilts, Owen's face was pale, and his hands shook when he lifted the cup of broth Ben had made from the salt pork. The storm continued. By the second night, the drift outside the entrance had risen to 5 feet. Eli and Ben could no longer dig out with a shovel. The entrance passage was too narrow, the angle too awkward. They had to crawl into the tunnel and pull snow back behind them in armfuls. "We need to build a frame," Eli said. "Something to hold the tunnel open so the snow can't fill it as fast." "With what?" They used the lintels from the storeroom cottonwood branches that had been cut for future repairs. Eli wedged them into the walls of the entrance passage, creating a skeleton that the snow could pack around but not crush. It was not a permanent solution, but it was something. On the morning of the third day, someone pounded on the door. Eli was asleep when it happened, a deep, exhausted sleep that came from 48 hours of digging and watching and worrying. The sound reached him from far away, a rhythmic thumping that became a fist on wood. He scrambled to the entrance. The door was frozen shut. Ice had formed around the seams where moisture from inside had met cold from outside. Eli threw his shoulder against the wood and felt it give, just slightly. The pounding continued. "Who's there?" A voice muffled by snow and wind and door. "Pritchard, let us in!" Eli hit the door again. It broke free, swinging outward into a wall of white. Through the gap, he saw faces: Nora Pritchard, wild-eyed and frost-rimed, and in her arms a bundle that was moving. "The children," Nora gasped. "Ruthie, she can't breathe." Eli pulled them inside. Nora's daughter was 4 years old and blew around the lips. The child's breath came in short, whistling gasps, each exhale accompanied by a sound like tearing cloth. Her eyes were glassy, unfocused. Her skin was so cold that touching her felt like touching the walls of the shelter. "How long?" Eli demanded. "Since yesterday. The house. The wind tore through the walls. We couldn't keep it warm enough." Nora was shaking, her words tumbling over each other. "Bell brought us as far as the creek, but his horse couldn't make the slope. He went back for rope. I couldn't wait. She's dying, Eli. She's dying." Ben had already moved, fetching quilts, building up the fire, making space near the hearth. Owen, despite his cough, was heating water for compresses. Eli looked at the child in Nora's arms. The sound of her breathing filled the room, each inhale a battle, each exhale a surrender. "The cold got into her chest," Nora said. "The cold air all night. She was breathing cold air, and now—" "Warm compresses," Eli said. "On her chest and throat. And steam. We need steam." He had seen this before, not in a child, but in calves, in the coldest winters when newborns breathed ice air and their lungs filled with fluid. The treatment was warmth, steady warmth, inside and out. They worked through the morning. Ben kept the fire high, higher than they had burned it since the storm began, feeding it with precious fuel because warmth was now more important than conservation. Owen heated stones in the coals and wrapped them in cloth, pressing them to the child's back while Nora held her against her chest. And slowly, so slowly that Eli was not sure it was real at first, the blue faded from Ruthie's lips. Ezra Bell arrived at noon. He came roped to his horse, following a line that Owen had thrown down the slope when the storm lulled briefly. His face was gray with cold, and ice had frozen his beard into a solid mass. "The Pritchard house," he said when he was inside. "Half the roof is gone. The wind peeled it back like paper." "Is anyone else hurt?" "No, but they can't stay there. I've got 3 more people outside, Nora's boy and 2 of the Cross children. The Cross place is worse than the Pritchards. They lost their stove when the chimney collapsed." Eli looked around the shelter. The main chamber was 12 by 14 feet. The sleeping room was 8 by 10. 3 brothers, Nora and her 2 children, 2 Cross children, 9 people, in a space built for 3. "Bring them in," he said. The shelter that Matthew Mercer had built for his sons became, on the 3rd day of the blizzard, something else entirely. 9 people packed the chambers, bodies pressed against bodies. Children cried, then quieted, then slept in heaps on the floor near the hearth. The air grew thick with the smell of too many humans in too small a space, but the walls held. The hearth drew. The stone, warmed by weeks of careful fires, released its stored heat back into the room. Outside, the wind continued to scream. Bell sat with his back against the wall, watching the fire. "I told you I'd bury all 3 of you," he said quietly. Eli was too tired to respond. "I was wrong about your father's work. I was wrong about you. You weren't wrong about the danger. No, the danger was real. Is real." Bell looked at the children sleeping in a pile near the hearth. "Half the houses in this stretch of the creek are failing tonight. Yours is the only one that's still warm. It's not a house, it's a hole in a cliff. It's a shelter, the only one that works." On the 4th day, someone else pounded on the door. Eli opened it, expecting more refugees, more neighbors fleeing collapsed roofs and frozen houses. What he found was Harlan Voss. The storekeeper was barely recognizable. His face was raw with frostbite, his coat torn, his hat gone. He stood in the entrance passage with snow caked to his eyebrows and his teeth chattering so violently he could barely speak. "My store," he managed. "The roof." Eli stepped back. "Come in." Voss stumbled through the door and stood swaying in the main chamber. The refugees already packed into the space looked up at him, Nora with her children, the Cross family, Ezra Bell. Voss's eyes moved from face to face, and Eli watched something shift in his expression. Shame. That was what it looked like. Shame and something else. "I didn't think," Voss started. He stopped, started again. "I said your father's shelter was a hole for people with no choices. I said, I remember what you said." Voss's jaw worked. "You have every right to send me back out." Eli looked at the man who had mocked him, refused him credit, laughed at his dead father's work, the man who had predicted their deaths and profited from the prediction. "No one goes back out," Eli said. "Sit by the fire." Voss sat. The storm lasted 5 days. By the time the wind died and the snow stopped flying, the drift outside the shelter entrance had risen to 8 feet. Eli dug out into a world transformed, white and silent and alien, the landscape he had known buried under snow so deep that familiar landmarks had vanished entirely. The cottonwoods by the creek were truncated, their lower halves swallowed by drift. The windbreak where the mule had sheltered was gone, buried without a trace. The route down to the claim site was impassable. Not just difficult, but genuinely impassable, a wall of white that would take days to cut through. Behind him, the refugees emerged one by one into the light. Ruthie Pritchard, 4 years old and breathing clearly now, held her mother's hand and squinted at the snow. "It's bright," she said. Nora laughed. It was a strange sound, cracked and raw on the edge of something else. "Yes, baby, it's bright." Ezra Bell was the first to find a neighbor's body. He found it a week after the storm, when the drifts had settled enough to travel. An older man named Hansen, who had lived alone on a claim east of the Mercers, dead in his cabin with the fire out and ice on his eyelashes. There were others. The stories came in over the following weeks, carried by survivors who had made it through in attics, in barns, in any structure that had held against the wind. Children who had walked to school in the warm morning and never made it home. Farmhands who had stepped outside to check on livestock and lost their way between barn and house. The January blizzard of 1888 killed hundreds across Nebraska, Dakota, and Minnesota. Many of the dead were found within sight of shelter, frozen in drifts after losing their direction in the white chaos of the storm. The Mercer brothers had lost a mule. They had lost nothing else. Owen's cough lingered for 2 weeks after the storm, then finally broke. He spent a month regaining the weight he had lost, the strength the cold had taken from him. By late February, he was back to hauling water and cutting fuel. Ben kept the records. He documented everything, who had sheltered with them, how many days they had stayed, what supplies had been consumed. He recorded the temperature readings Eli took each morning, the fuel usage, the food stores. Nora Pritchard returned to her claim and found her house still standing, damaged but repairable. She spent a week with her children in the Mercer shelter while she patched the roof and sealed the walls. "I owe you," she told Eli when she left. "No. You helped us first. Onions and old wool. You gave my daughter her life." Eli had no answer to that. The Cross children went home to a house that had been rebuilt by neighbors while they sheltered in the bluff. Their father cried when he came to collect them, a grown man weeping openly in front of strangers, and could not find words to thank the Mercer boys for what they had done. Harlan Voss said nothing when he left. He walked down the slope to the creek, turned once to look back at the entrance hidden in the stone, and kept walking. But the next week, a crate appeared at the base of the bluff. Flour, sugar, coffee, nails, no note, no explanation. Eli did not mention it to anyone. The shelter had held. In the worst storm the Nebraska plains had seen in a decade, in temperatures that killed cattle standing up and froze men between their own front doors and their own barns, the hole that Matthew Mercer had carved into the bluff had kept 11 people alive. Eli stood at the entrance on the first warm day of March and thought about his father. Matthew Mercer had not lived to see his work tested. He had died in December, coughing blood into a handkerchief, not knowing whether the shelter would hold or fail. He had spent years cutting stone in secret, preparing for a catastrophe he might never witness, trusting that his sons would find the door and understand what he had built. Trust the stone before the boards. That was what he had written, and he had been right. The stone had held. The boards had failed, across the settlement, in house after house. Walls had buckled, and roofs had collapsed, and fires had gone out. But the stone, deep in the bluff, where the wind could not reach and the cold could not penetrate, had held. Eli touched the door frame. The wood was worn now, the surface smoothed by months of hands passing through. His father had cut this frame, fitted these planks, hung this door. "Thank you," he said quietly. The wind carried his words away, but he thought maybe, somewhere, his father heard them anyway. Spring came slowly to the Nebraska plains. The drifts that had buried the world in January settled and hardened through February, then began to soften in March as the sun climbed higher and the days stretched longer. Water ran in channels beneath the snow, carving paths that would become streams, then creeks, then the muddy roads that connected claim to claim across the prairie. Eli emerged from the shelter into a changed landscape. Not just the physical changes, the snow still deep in shadowed places, the creek running high with melt, but something else. Something in the way people looked at him when he walked to town. They knew. Everyone knew. The story of the Mercer boys and the cliff shelter had spread through the settlement in the weeks after the blizzard. How Matthew Mercer had spent years carving a refuge his sons did not know existed. How 3 boys with $26 and 1 mule had survived a storm that killed hundreds. How the shelter had held 11 people through 5 days of wind that tore roofs from houses and froze men in their own doorways. The story had become something larger than the truth. Eli heard versions of it that made him wince. Tales of underground palaces with multiple hearths, of food stores that could last years, of secret passages and hidden rooms. The reality was simpler and smaller, but the reality did not matter. What mattered was that the Mercer shelter had worked when everything else had failed. People wanted to know how. Ezra Bell came to the shelter in late March, when the snow had retreated enough that a horse could make the climb. He did not come alone. 3 men rode with him, homesteaders from claims farther east, men Eli recognized from town but had never spoken to. They dismounted at the base of the slope and stood looking up at the bluff face, searching for the door they had heard so much about. "Show them," Bell said. Eli led them up the slope to the entrance. The door was visible now. The weathering that had concealed it through the autumn had been scraped away by months of hands passing through, and the wood grain stood out clearly against the stone. The men filed inside one by one. Eli watched their faces as they took in the space. The main chamber with its low ceiling and stone walls. The hearth, cold now, but still marked with soot from months of burning. The sleeping room with its carved bunks. The storeroom with its shelves. "Your father built this," one of the men said. His name was Garrett, a thin man with a beard that needed trimming. "Yes, sir." "How long did it take him?" "Years. We think he started before my mother died." Garrett ran his hand along the wall, feeling the chisel marks. "See, I lost 2 calves in the blizzard," he said. "Had to shoot a third because its legs froze. My wife and children spent 4 days in the attic because the first floor wouldn't hold heat." He turned to look at Eli. "We almost died in a house I spent 3 years building." Eli did not know what to say. "I want to learn," Garrett said. "Whatever your father knew, whatever you learned finishing this place, I want to learn it." The other men nodded. Bell stood in the doorway, his arms crossed. "I told these boys I'd bury them before thaw," he said. "I was wrong. Their father built something that worked when nothing else did. If they're willing to teach, the rest of us should be willing to learn." Eli looked at the faces around him, men who had dismissed his father as odd, who had wondered why Matthew Mercer spent so much time away from his claim, who had shaken their heads at the idea of 3 boys trying to survive alone. Now they were asking him to teach them. "I'll show you what I know," Eli said. "But I didn't do this alone. The Bohemian, Anton Krall, he's the one who taught me the stonework. If you want to learn properly, you need to learn from him." The teaching began in April. Krall was reluctant at first. His leg had worsened over the winter, the old injury flaring with each change in weather, and the walk from his claim to the Mercer Bluff was more than he could manage most days. But when Eli brought the students to him instead, when he saw men who had survived the blizzard sitting in his small cabin, waiting to learn, something shifted in his face. "You want to build shelters," he said. "Yes, sir." "Not houses, shelters. Shelters that will hold when houses fail." Krall was quiet for a long moment. "Then we start with the stone," he said. "Everything else follows from the stone." He taught them the way he had taught Eli, through demonstration, through repetition, through making them feel the difference between solid rock and fractured stone. He showed them how to read a bank, how to find the soft seams where cutting would be easier, how to avoid the hard layers that would break tools and break spirits. He showed them the throat. "This is where most men fail," he said, standing in the Mercer shelter with a lamp held high. "They build a hearth, they build a chimney, and they think they are finished. But the throat is everything, too wide, and the smoke rolls back, too narrow, and the draft whistles and steals your heat. The angle matters. The smoothness matters. Everything matters." The men listened. They asked questions. They made notes in the margins of papers they had brought from home. Eli watched and felt something strange, a pride that was not quite his own. His father had built this place. His father had learned these lessons and encoded them in stone. Now that knowledge was spreading outward, hand to hand, the way Krall had said knowledge always moved. Nora Pritchard came to the shelter in May. She did not come to learn, she came to ask. "My root cellar," she said. It flooded in the thaw. I lost half my stores. I'm sorry. I don't want sorry. I want to know how your father kept this place dry. Eli showed her. The drainage trench outside the entrance, angled to carry water away from the door. The raised floor of the storeroom, set 6 inches above the level of the main chamber. The ventilation gaps near the ceiling that allowed moisture to escape without letting cold air in. He thought about everything, Nora said. He had time to think. Years. Most men don't use time that way. My father wasn't most men. Nora looked at him with an expression he could not read. No, she said, he wasn't, and neither are his sons. She left with measurements and sketches, plans for improving her own cellar. A week later, she sent word that she had deepened her drainage and raised her floor. The next rain tested it, and the cellar stayed dry. The spread of knowledge was slow at first, then faster. Garrett built a storm shelter into a hillside on his claim, not as elaborate as the Mercer shelter, but deep enough and tight enough to hold his family through a bad night. He finished it in June and invited Eli to inspect the throat. Is it right? Eli looked up into the flue. The angle was steeper than his father's design, but the throat narrowed properly and the stone was fitted tight. Light a fire, he said. Garrett lit a small fire in the hearth. The smoke rose, hesitant at first, curling at the edges, then caught the draft and pulled clean. It's right, Eli said. Garrett's face split into a grin. We can survive now, he said. Whatever comes, we can survive. 2 more shelters went up before the end of summer, then 3 more in the fall. Each one was different. Some cut into hillsides, some dug down into flat ground with sawed roofs, some built against existing structures to take advantage of shared walls. But all of them shared the principles that Matthew Mercer had encoded in the bluff. Deep earth for insulation, proper draft for heating, careful sealing against wind and water. The settlement was changing. Harlan Voss watched the changes from behind the counter of his store. The man who had mocked the Mercer boys, who had called their father's shelter a hole for people with no choices, now sold lime and nails and lamp oil to families building their own versions. He took their money without comment, wrapped their purchases without meeting their eyes. But Eli saw what others did not see. The resentment that flickered in Voss's face when customers mentioned the cliff shelter. The way his jaw tightened when someone asked if he had considered building a storm shelter of his own. Voss had been the man who profited from failure. When a family could not pay their debts, Voss bought their equipment cheap. When a claim was abandoned, Voss acquired the land. His power came from the fear that the frontier would kill those who were not prepared and from being the only source of the supplies that might save them. Now the equation was shifting. Families with storm shelters did not panic at the first sign of bad weather. Homesteaders who had survived the blizzard in the Mercer Refuge did not look at Voss with the same desperate need. He was still the only storekeeper in 14 miles, but he was no longer the only source of hope. Anton Kral's health failed in July. Eli knew something was wrong when Kral did not appear for a scheduled lesson. He walked to the Bohemian's claim and found him sitting outside his small cabin, his face gray and his breathing shallow. The lungs, Kral said when Eli asked. The railroad dust. It catches up eventually. You should see a doctor. Doctors cannot fix what the mountain broke. Kral coughed, and the sound was wet and thick. I have known this was coming for years. I hope to have more time. Time is what we always hope for. Eli sat beside him. What can I do? Finish what I started, you and your brothers. The teaching. Another cough, longer this time. The teaching matters more than the teacher. You're not dying. Not today. Maybe not this month, but soon. Kral looked at Eli with eyes that were still sharp, still clear, despite the ruin of his body. I want to show you one more thing, while I still can. They walked to the Mercer shelter together, Kral leaning heavily on his cane, Eli matching his pace. It took an hour to cover ground that should have taken 15 minutes. By the time they reached the entrance, Kral was pale and trembling. Inside, he moved to the hearth and knelt beside it. His bad legs stuck out at an angle, but he did not seem to notice. "Your father asked me once why I worked stone," he said. "Why I spent my life cutting into mountains instead of building on top of them." Eli waited. "I told him it was because the mountain is honest. Wood warps, metal rusts. But stone tells you exactly what it is. Strike it, and it rings true or it rings hollow. There is no deception in stone." Crawl ran his hand along the throat of the hearth. "Your father understood this. He learned to listen to the stone, to let it guide his chisel instead of fighting against its grain. That is why his work holds. Not because he was strong or fast or clever, but because he was patient, because he trusted the stone before the boards." "He wrote that," Eli said, "on the back of the map. Trust the stone before the boards." "Yes," Crawl smiled. It was the first time Eli had ever seen him smile. "He learned, and now you have learned, and the men you teach will learn. That is how knowledge survives, not in books, not in buildings, but in the hands of those who do the work." He pressed something into Eli's palm. It was a hammer. Small, with a head shaped like a wedge, worn smooth by decades of use. Eli recognized it, the tool Crawl had used to sound the ceiling on that first day of teaching, to test the stone for hollow spots and hidden fractures. "I do not have sons," Crawl said. "I do not have students, not really. The men who learned from me on the railroad are scattered or dead. But you?" He held Eli's gaze. "You listen. You think before you strike. You trust the stone." "I can't take this." "You can. You must." Crawl closed Eli's fingers around the handle. "Stone tells the truth if you strike it honest. Remember that when I am gone." Anton Crawl died on the 14th of August, 1888. Eli learned of it from Nora Pritchard, who had gone to check on the old man and found him sitting in his chair with his eyes closed and his hands folded in his lap. He looked peaceful, she said, like a man who had finished his work. The settlement buried him on his claim, in ground that he had chosen himself years earlier, a spot where the bedrock came close to the surface and the digging was easy. Eli spoke at the grave, though he did not know what to say. He talked about stone, about patience, about a man who had taught a boy to read the ceiling and finish a hearth. It was not enough. Nothing he could say would be enough. The weeks after Crawl's death were the hardest Eli had faced since losing his father. He had not realized how much he had come to rely on the old Bohemian, not just for knowledge, but for something else. Certainty, maybe. The confidence that came from having someone who could answer questions, who could look at a problem and see the solution. Now there was no one to ask. Eli stood in the shelter and looked at the walls his father had cut, the hearth Crawl had helped him finish. Two men who had taught him everything he knew, both gone, both beyond asking. But the work was not gone. The knowledge was not gone. He picked up Crawl's hammer and felt its weight in his hand. Then he walked out of the shelter and down the slope to where Owen was waiting. "Garrett's son wants to learn the throat work," Owen said. "He's been asking for weeks." "Then we teach him." "You know enough?" Eli thought about his father, cutting stone by lamplight in secret, about Crawl, coughing blood into his handkerchief while demonstrating the proper angle of a flue. "I know enough," he said, "and what I don't know, we'll figure out together." There is a moment in the life of any skill when it passes from knowing to doing to teaching. Eli reached that moment in the autumn of 1888. The men who came to learn no longer needed Crawl's guidance. They came to Eli, and Eli taught them what Crawl had taught him, adding his own observations, his own mistakes, his own hard-won understanding. He taught Garrett's son to sound the stone. He taught a widow named Pierce to angle her drainage trench. He taught 3 brothers from a claim near the river how to seal a door jamb against wind. With each lesson, the knowledge spread further. With each shelter built, the community grew stronger. And with each passing week, Eli felt less like a boy who had stumbled onto his father's secret, and more like a man who had earned the right to carry it forward. The second crisis came in late September. It began with smoke. Eli smelled it before he saw it, the sharp, acrid smell of burning grass, carried on a wind that had shifted overnight from west to south. He came out of the shelter at dawn and saw the horizon glowing. Prairie fire. It was moving fast, pushed by a wind that had not let up since midnight. Eli could see the wall of flame in the distance, a line of orange and red that stretched from one edge of the world to the other. Between the fire and the Mercer claim lay miles of dry grass, cured by summer sun and autumn wind into perfect fuel. Owen appeared beside him. How long? Hours, maybe less if the wind picks up. What do we do? Eli thought about his father, about the fire that had destroyed everything the Mercers had built. That fire had come in autumn too, when the grass was dry and the wind was wrong. That fire had killed the cabin, the barn, the woodshed. It had started the chain of events that led to Matthew Mercer's death. This time would be different. We move everything into the shelter, Eli said. Everything we can carry, food, tools, clothes. Then we wet down the entrance and seal the door. The shelter won't burn. Stone doesn't burn. The door might, but we can soak it. The inside will stay cool, and the smoke can't get in if we seal the gaps. Owen nodded. He did not ask more questions. He had learned to trust his brother's judgment. The fire reached the Mercer claim at midday. Eli watched it come from the shelter entrance. The door cracked open just enough to see. The wall of flame was taller than a man, roaring as it consumed the dry grass, throwing sparks into the air that caught and spread the destruction further. It swept across the open ground where the cabin had once stood. It consumed the windbreak by the creek, the makeshift pen where the mule had died in the blizzard. It rushed up the slope toward the bluff, hungry and fast, and then it stopped. The bluff face was stone. The entrance to the shelter was recessed, protected by a lip of rock that the flames could not reach. The door was soaked with water from the creek, and the gaps around it were packed with wet clay. The fire roared against the stone for a long, terrifying minute. Eli felt the heat even through the door, felt sweat break out on his face and arms. Then the wind shifted, and the flames moved on, sweeping east toward the next claim, the next patch of dry grass. When Eli opened the door, the world outside was black. The grass was gone, replaced by ash and char. The cottonwoods by the creek were scorched, their leaves stripped away, their bark blackened. The sky was hazy with smoke, but the shelter had held. Stone did not burn. The fire took 3 claims before it reached the breaks along the river and burned itself out. No one died. That was the miracle, a prairie fire that consumed miles of grass and dozens of outbuildings without killing a single person. The warning had been enough. Families had fled to cellars, to the river, to the stone shelters that some of them had built in the months since the blizzard. The Garrett shelter held a family of 6 through the worst of it. The Pierce shelter held a widow and her 3 children. The storm cellars that had been deepened and improved since winter became refuges against fire as well as cold. The Mercer shelter held 7. Eli had not counted until afterward. Neighbors who had seen the smoke and known they could not outrun the flames, who had climbed the bluff and pounded on the door the way Nora Pritchard had pounded during the blizzard. 7 people, packed into a space built for 3, waiting in the dark while the world burned outside. The pattern was the same. The mathematics were the same. Stone against flame instead of stone against cold. But the principle held. Earth sheltered, stone endured. Harlan Voss lost his store. The fire had jumped the fire break he thought would protect him, caught the dry goods inventory stored in his back room, and spread faster than he could respond. By the time neighbors arrived with buckets, the building was fully engulfed. Voss stood in the ashes the next morning, his face blank, his hands hanging at his sides. Eli found him there. "I'm sorry," Eli said. Voss did not look at him. "The credit books are gone," Voss said. "Every account, every record, years of business, gone." "Insurance?" Voss laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. "There is no insurance on the frontier. There's only what you build and what you lose." He kicked at a charred beam. "I told you your father's shelter was for people with no choices. Look at me now." Eli did not know what to say. The man who had mocked him, refused him credit, laughed at the idea that a hole in a cliff could save anyone. That man was standing in the ruins of everything he had built. "You can rebuild," Eli said. "With what?" "The inventory is ash. The building is ash. The accounts—" Voss stopped. His jaw worked. "The accounts are ash." "Then start over. Easy for you to say. You have your stone house, your brothers, your knowledge that everyone wants to learn." Voss finally looked at him. "What do I have?" Eli thought about it. "You have the same thing my brothers and I had after the fire took our cabin. Nothing but what you choose to build next." Voss stared at him. "You're offering advice? To me?" "I'm telling you what I learned. Starting from nothing is hard, but it's not impossible. My father proved that. Kral proved that. Half the people in this settlement proved it." Voss was silent for a long moment. "Your father's shelter," he said finally. "During the blizzard, you let me in." "I let everyone in." "You could have left me outside after what I said, what I did." "No." Eli shook his head. "I couldn't have. That's not—" He searched for the words. "That's not what my father built the shelter for. It wasn't just for us. It was for anyone who needed it." Voss looked at him with an expression Eli could not read. "I need help," he said. The words seemed to cost him something. "My back wall, the store's back wall, it was built against a cut in the bank. The fire hollowed it out, but the stone is still there. If someone who knew stonework could look at it, tell me if it could be rebuilt." "I'll look at it," Eli said. "I can't pay you." "I know." Voss's face twisted. "Why?" Eli thought about his father, working alone in the dark, building something no one knew existed. About Kral, teaching skills he would never use again to a boy he barely knew. About Nora, bringing onions and wool when the Mercers had nothing to give in return. "Because that's how things get built," he said. "One person helps another. The debt gets paid forward, not back." Eli inspected Voss's back wall the next day. The stone was sound. The fire had charred the wooden frame, but left the underlying rock intact. With work, the wall could be rebuilt. With more work, the entire store could rise again, this time with stone foundations that would resist fire better than the wooden frame had. "It's possible," Eli told Voss. "You'd need to clear the debris, shore up the loose sections. Then you build on what remains." "Will you show me how?" Eli looked at the man who had been his enemy, or at least his antagonist, the voice that said the Mercer boys would fail, the hand that refused them credit when they needed it most. "Yes," he said. "I'll show you." The teaching that followed was different from the lessons Eli had given to others. Voss was not humble, not grateful, not eager to learn. He questioned everything, challenged every technique, demanded explanations for decisions that Eli had made by instinct. But he learned. By the end of October, the back wall of Voss's store was rebuilt. By November, the frame was rising. By December, a year after Matthew Mercer had died in a half-built shelter on a burned-out claim, Harlan Voss opened for business again in a building that had stone foundations and a cellar deep enough to survive fire or cold. He never thanked Eli directly, but the prices in his store dropped. The credit terms loosened, and when families came in asking about storm shelters, about stonework, about the lessons the Mercer boy was teaching, Voss pointed them toward the bluff without comment or sneer. It was not friendship, it was not forgiveness, but it was something. The first anniversary of Matthew Mercer's death fell on a cold December day. Eli walked to his father's grave at dawn. The stone marker was rough, cut by Eli's own hands in the months after the burial, and the letters were uneven, but they were legible. Matthew Mercer, 1839 to 1887. He built what lasted. Owen and Ben joined him as the sun rose. They stood in silence, 3 brothers who had been boys a year ago, who had faced impossible mathematics and found an answer carved into stone. "Do you think he knew?" Ben asked. "Knew what?" that we would find it, that it would work. That? Ben gestured vaguely at the world around them. All of this. Eli thought about his father, working alone in the dark, chiseling by lamplight, hiding a map in a seed box with a false bottom. I think he hoped, Eli said. I don't think he knew. No one can know something like that. You do the work, you make the choices, and then you wait to see if you were right. Kral had said something similar, standing at the entrance to the shelter, looking at the storm gathering on the horizon. He was right, Owen said. Yes. Eli touched the cold stone of his father's marker. He was right. The shelter that Matthew Mercer built for his sons had become something else entirely. It was still a refuge, still the place the brothers slept, still the place they stored food and weathered storms, but it was also a classroom, a model, a proof of concept. People came from claims miles away to see it, to walk through the chambers, to feel the walls and study the throat of the hearth. Eli no longer thought of it as his father's shelter. It was his now. His and Owen's and Ben's. They had finished what their father started, had kept it working through the worst winter in memory, had used it to save lives beyond their own. And now they were teaching others to build the same. The community that had nearly broken apart in the blizzard of 1888 was knitting itself back together, stronger than before. Neighbors helped neighbors dig shelters. Knowledge passed from hand to hand. The fear that had made every winter a gamble was fading, replaced by something that felt almost like confidence. Not safety. The frontier was never safe. But preparation. The understanding that with the right knowledge and the right work, survival was not a matter of luck. Eli thought about that as the first snow of the new winter began to fall. His father had given them a gift, not just the shelter, but the knowledge of how to build it. Kral had added to that gift, deepening it, sharpening it. And now Eli was passing it forward, adding his own mistakes and discoveries, watching the knowledge grow and spread. That was how things lasted, not in stone alone, but in the hands of those who learned to work it. The winter of 1888 to 1889 was milder than the year before. That was what people said anyway, that the storms came softer, that the cold was less bitter, that the wind showed mercy where it had shown none the previous January. Eli did not believe in mercy from the weather. He believed in preparation, and the settlement had prepared. 14 shelters now dotted the claims along the creek and eastward toward town. Some were elaborate, multi-room dugouts carved into hillsides with proper hearths and ventilation systems modeled on the Mercer design. Others were simpler, storm cellars deepened and improved with better drainage and tighter seals. All of them shared the same principle. When the surface failed, go beneath it. The blizzards came. 3 of them, spaced through January and February, each one testing the work that had been done since the fire. And the work held. No one died that winter, not in the settlement, not on any of the claims that had built shelters, not among the families who had learned to read the sky and move underground before the wind arrived. Ezra Bell came to the Mercer shelter in March, when the 3rd storm had passed and the drifts were beginning to settle. I've been counting, he said. Eli looked up from the harness he was mending. Owen had acquired a new mule in the fall, a trade with a family moving west, and the animal needed equipment. Counting what? The shelters, the people who used them this winter. Bell sat down on a stone ledge near the entrance. He looked older than he had a year ago, the lines in his face deeper, his movements slower. 63 people spent at least one night underground during the storms. 63 people who would have been in surface houses fighting drafts and failing fires. That's good. That's more than good. That's... Bell stopped. He seemed to be searching for words. I've been on this prairie for 13 winters now. I've seen what happens when people aren't ready. I've buried friends, neighbors, strangers who got caught between their own front doors and their own barns. This winter, I didn't bury anyone. Eli set down the harness. My father would be glad to hear that. Your father built something that mattered. But you, Bell pointed at Eli. You made it spread. You taught people. You turned one shelter into 14. That's not something every man can do. I had help. Crawl, Nora, Owen, and Ben. Everyone has help. The question is what you do with it. Bell stood up, his joints creaking. I came to tell you something. The county is talking about putting up a meeting hall in town, a proper building, not just Voss's back room. They want it to have a stone foundation and a cellar underneath, a place where people can gather when the storms come. That's a big project. It is, and they want you to advise on it. Eli stared at him. Me? You're the one who knows the work. You're the one who's been teaching it. Who else would they ask? The meeting hall project began in April of 1889. It was the largest construction effort the settlement had ever undertaken, a building 40 feet long and 25 feet wide, with stone foundations sunk 3 feet into the ground and a cellar beneath that could hold 50 people in an emergency. The design was based on the principles Eli had learned from his father and Crawl, adapted for a larger scale. Eli did not build it alone. He could not have. The project required dozens of hands, weeks of labor, materials hauled from quarries and lumber yards miles away, but he guided the work, advising on foundation depth, on drainage angles, on the placement of the cellar hearth that would keep the underground space warm in the worst weather. Owen handled the teams and the hauling, coordinating the movement of stone and timber with an efficiency that surprised Eli. His younger brother had grown into the work, had found his place in the logistics of construction the way Eli had found his in the techniques. Ben kept the records. Every load of stone, every board of lumber, every nail and hinge and pane of glass, Ben tracked it all in ledgers he had taught himself to keep. He had a gift for numbers, for organization, for turning chaos into order. The three brothers worked together the way they had worked in the shelter, each one filling a role, each one trusting the others to do their part. Ruth Dinsmore arrived in the settlement in May. She came as a school teacher, hired by the county to replace a man who had decided that Nebraska winters were more than he could bear. She was 23 years old, Nora Pritchard's cousin from Illinois, and she had never seen a prairie fire or a blizzard or a shelter carved into stone. Eli met her at the meeting hall site. She had come to see the construction. Everyone in the settlement had come at one point or another, curious about the building rising at the center of town. She stood at the edge of the foundation trench and watched the men laying stone, her face thoughtful. "You're one of the Mercer brothers," she said when Eli approached. "Eli, the oldest." "Nora told me about you, about your father's shelter." Ruth looked at the foundation. "She said you saved her daughter's life during the blizzard." "The shelter saved her. We just kept the fire burning." "That's not how Nora tells it." Eli did not know what to say. He was not used to being spoken about, to being the subject of stories that others told. "This foundation," Ruth said, changing the subject, "it's deeper than most buildings. 3 feet. We want it below the frost line." "Why?" Eli found himself explaining. The way frozen ground heaved, the way shallow foundations cracked and shifted, the way a building needed to be anchored in earth that did not move. Ruth listened with an attention that surprised him. She asked questions, good questions, the kind that showed she was thinking about what he said rather than just hearing it. "You know a lot about this," she said when he finished. "My father taught me, and a man named Crawl, who used to work the railroad cuts. Nora mentioned him too. She said he died last summer." "Yes." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "It must be strange," she said, "carrying knowledge that someone else gave you, being the one who has to pass it on." Eli thought about his father, working alone in the dark, about Crawl, pressing the hammer into his hand, about all the lessons he had learned and was still learning, the weight of knowledge that grew heavier the more he understood. "It's not strange," he said. "It's just necessary. If I don't teach it, it dies with me. And then my father's work, Crawl's work, all of it was for nothing." Ruth looked at him with an expression he could not read. "You're not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Someone older, maybe. Someone who acts like they have all the answers." She smiled. You don't act like that. I don't have all the answers. No, but you're honest about what you don't know. That's rarer than you might think. The meeting hall was completed in August. The dedication ceremony drew families from claims miles away, people who had heard about the building with its stone foundations and its cellar, who wanted to see for themselves what the Mercer boy had helped create. Eli stood at the back of the crowd and watched the county commissioner cut a ribbon stretched across the door. This building, the commissioner said, represents what we can accomplish when we work together, when we learn from those who came before us, when we prepare for the challenges we know are coming. He went on, the way commissioners did, but Eli stopped listening. He was looking at the building, at the walls he had helped design, the foundation he had helped lay, the cellar beneath that could hold 50 people when the storms came. His father had built one shelter, in secret, for his sons. Now there were 15, 16 counting the meeting hall, and more being planned, more knowledge spreading, more hands learning the work. Ruth appeared beside him. "You should be up there," she said quietly. "They should be thanking you by name." "I don't need thanks. Need and deserve are different things." Eli looked at her. She had been in the settlement for 3 months now, teaching children in a one-room schoolhouse, boarding with Nora Pritchard, learning the rhythms of prairie life. In that time, she had become a familiar presence at the construction site, at the Pritchard claim, at the Mercer shelter when she came to see what Matthew Mercer had built. "Would you like to see the cellar?" he asked. "Now?" "After the speeches, I can show you how the hearth works." Ruth smiled. "I'd like that." The courtship, such as it was, happened through work. Eli taught Ruth to read a foundation the way Crawl had taught him to read a ceiling, by looking for the signs of stress, the places where pressure built and needed to be relieved. She learned quickly, asking questions that pushed Eli to explain things he had understood only by instinct. Ruth taught Eli to keep better records. She showed him how to organize his observations about stone and drainage and heating into notes that others could follow. "Knowledge in your head dies with you," she said. "Knowledge on paper can travel." They worked together through the fall, Ruth helping Ben with the ledgers while Eli supervised the construction of 2 more shelters on claims to the east. By the time the first snow fell, something had changed between them, a comfort, an ease, a sense that they fit together in ways that did not need to be spoken. Owen noticed first. "You should marry her," he said one evening as they sat by the hearth in the shelter. Eli looked up from the leather he was working, a new strap for the harness. "What?" "Ruth. You should marry her. She's smart, she's capable, and she looks at you like you're the only person in the room." "She does not." "She does." Ben noticed too. Ben, sitting across the room with a ledger open in his lap, nodded without looking up. "I'm not." Eli stopped. "We've only known each other a few months." "Pa knew Ma for 3 weeks before he proposed. He told me that once when I asked how people decide." Eli thought about his mother, dead these 4 years now, her face fading in his memory until only impressions remained, the smell of bread baking, the sound of her voice singing in the evenings, the warmth of her hand on his forehead when he was sick. That was different. How? Eli did not have an answer. He proposed in December, on the 2nd anniversary of his father's death. They were standing at Matthew Mercer's grave, Ruth beside him in the cold morning air. She had asked to come, had said she wanted to pay her respects to the man who had built something that saved so many lives. Eli had not known how to refuse. "He would have liked you," Eli said, looking at the stone marker. "You think so?" "He valued competence, practicality. You have both." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "Nora told me about the map, how your father hid it in a seed box, how Ben found it after he died. She said it was the only reason you survived." "It was one reason. There were others." "What others?" Eli thought about it. Owen, who wouldn't give up even when it seemed impossible. Ben, who noticed things the rest of us missed. Crowell, who taught me to finish what my father started. Nora, who brought onions when we had nothing. He paused. Bel, who told us we would die and made us determined to prove him wrong. And you, Ruth said, who held all of it together. I just did what needed to be done. That's what holding things together means. Eli turned to face her. The cold had reddened her cheeks and put frost on her eyelashes. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with softness, a beauty of clarity, of directness, of strength that did not need to announce itself. I want to build something with you, he said. Not just shelters, a life, a family, something that lasts. Ruth's eyes widened. Eli, you don't have to answer now. I know it's sudden. I know we haven't. Yes. He stopped. Yes? Yes, I want that too. She took his hand, her fingers cold against his. I came to Nebraska because I wanted to be useful, to do work that mattered. And then I met you and I realized the work I want to do is the work you're already doing, building things, teaching people, preparing for what's coming. She squeezed his hand. So yes, I'll marry you. I'll build a life with you. I'll help you carry your father's work forward. They married in the spring of 1890 in the meeting hall that Eli had helped build. The ceremony was simple, a minister from town, a handful of neighbors, the smell of new wood and fresh paint. Ruth wore a dress that Nora had helped her make, plain but well fitted. Eli wore the coat that had belonged to his father, cleaned and mended, and still carrying a faint smell of smoke from the fire that had destroyed everything else. Ben stood as witness. Owen gave the toast. To Eli and Ruth, Owen said, raising a cup of cider, who found each other in the middle of nowhere and decided to build something anyway. It was not eloquent, but it was true. The years that followed moved faster than Eli expected. In 1891, Ruth gave birth to their first child, a daughter they named Sarah, after Eli's mother. The baby was born in the shelter, in the same room where Eli had weathered the blizzard, and her first cries echoed off walls that Matthew Mercer had carved by lamplight. In 1892, Ben left for the territorial capital to study surveying. He had a gift for measurement, for turning rough sketches into precise plans, and the county assessor had offered to sponsor his training. He promised to return, and he did, every summer to help with construction projects and to see his niece. In 1893, Owen took up a claim 2 miles east, building his own shelter using the techniques their father had developed and Eli had refined. He married a widow named Clara, who had 2 children from her first husband, and his house filled with noise and laughter. In 1894, the settlement got a name. It had been called the Creek Claims, or Near Scott's Bluff, for years, but the post office required something more specific. The residents voted, and the name that won was Mercer's Crossing, not for Eli, who protested, but for Matthew, who had built the first stone shelter on the bluff. Eli accepted the honor on his father's behalf. He stood in the meeting hall where the vote was taken and said a few words about the man who had carved a refuge in secret, who had died before he could see it tested, who had trusted his sons to find the door and finish what he started. He built what lasted, Eli said. That's all any of us can hope to do. The shelter in the bluff remained. As the years passed, as the settlement grew into a town, as sod houses gave way to frame buildings and frame buildings gave way to brick, the original Mercer shelter stayed what it had always been, a room carved into stone, warmed by a hearth that Anton Krall had helped complete, stocked with supplies against the storms that still came every winter. Eli brought his children there to show them. Sarah first, then her brother Matthew, named for his grandfather, then the youngest, a boy called Anton, who never met the man he was named for, but learned to strike stone honest with the hammer that had been passed down. Your great-grandfather built this, Eli told them, standing in the main chamber with a lamp in his hand. With nothing but hand tools and time. He didn't know if it would work. He just knew it needed to exist. The children ran their fingers along the walls, feeling the chisel marks, the same marks that Krall had traced with his hands years before. Why didn't he tell anyone? Sarah asked. I don't know. Maybe he meant to. Maybe he was waiting until it was finished. Maybe he just Eli paused, thinking about his father, about all the things he would never know. Maybe he just worked the way he lived, quietly, without needing anyone to notice. Do people still use it? Young Matthew asked. When the storms come? Sometimes. When the weather is bad and someone needs a place to shelter, it's not the only refuge anymore. There are dozens now, all over the county, but it was the first. It's where everything started. Eli Mercer lived to see the new century arrive. He was 52 years old in 1900, his hair gray, his hands scarred from decades of working stone. Ruth was beside him, her own hair streaked with white, her face lined with years of prairie sun and prairie wind. They stood on the porch of the house they had built, not in the bluff, but near it, on the claim where his father's cabin had burned, and watched the sky lighten on the first day of a new era. Your father would be proud, Ruth said. Eli thought about Matthew Mercer, who had died in 1887 with a shelter half finished and 3 sons who did not know it existed, who had trusted that the work would matter, that the knowledge would survive, that the door carved into stone would be found and used. I hope so, he said. The settlement that had been a handful of claims was now a town of 300 people. The meeting hall had been expanded twice. The shelters that had started with one man's secret labor now numbered in the dozens, scattered across the county, each one a small fortress against the weather that still came hard every winter. And the knowledge, the techniques of stone and drainage and draft that Matthew Mercer had learned and Anton Krall had refined and Eli had taught to anyone who would listen, that knowledge had spread further than any of them could have imagined. Other counties had adopted it. Other territories had sent people to learn. A professor from an eastern university had visited the previous year, taking notes for a paper on vernacular architecture. The stone told the truth, Krall had said, and the truth had traveled. Eli Mercer died in the winter of 1912 at the age of 64. He died in the shelter his father had built, in the room where he had weathered the blizzard of 1888, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. The hearth was burning, the same hearth he had finished with Anton Krall's help 44 years earlier, and the walls were warm with stored heat. His last words were to Ruth, who sat beside him holding his hand. "Thank you," he said, "for building with me." She buried him next to his father, in the plot where Matthew Mercer had lain for 25 years. The stone marker she chose was simple, cut from the same sandstone as the bluff. Eli Mercer, 1868 to 1912. He finished what was started. Within 5 years of Eli Mercer's death, 37 families in the county had built shelters using the techniques he had taught. The County Agricultural Extension published a pamphlet on underground construction with diagrams based on the original Mercer shelter. 3 different newspapers wrote articles about the Bluff Refuge and the man who had carved it, though they sometimes confused the father with the son, the builder with the teacher. The knowledge outlasted the knower. That was what mattered. Eli had said once that knowledge in your head dies with you, but knowledge that spreads survives. He had learned that from Ruth, who had learned it from the practice of teaching, who understood that the purpose of understanding was not to possess, but to pass on. The children who had learned from Eli taught their own children. The shelters that had been built in the 80s and 90s were improved, expanded, connected to newer buildings. The techniques evolved, adapted, grew, but the core remained the same. Go deep. Trust the stone. Prepare before the storm. The winter of 1988 brought the worst blizzard in a century to the Nebraska plains. 100 years after the storm that had tested Matthew Mercer's shelter and found it sound, another storm came howling out of the northwest. Temperatures dropped. Wind screamed across the open ground. Snow fell sideways with enough force to bury cars, to close highways, to strand travelers in drifts that rose higher than their heads. In the town that still bore the Mercer name, people moved underground. The original shelter in the bluff was a museum now, maintained by the Historical Society, open to visitors who wanted to see where it had all started. But on the night of the storm, The caretaker opened the door and let in a family whose car had slid off the road a quarter-mile away. A mother, a father, two children shivering in coats that were not warm enough. They sheltered there until morning, in the room that Matthew Mercer had carved and Eli Mercer had finished, warmed by a fire in the hearth that Anton Krall had helped complete. The stone still held. The stone would always hold. Ezra Bell had ridden to the Mercer claim in the autumn of 1887 and found 3 boys standing in the ashes of everything their father had built. He had counted the wood, measured the time, calculated the mathematics of survival, and delivered his verdict with the certainty of a man who had seen 11 winters kill everyone who was not prepared. "Wait, if you boys stay on this claim with no roof worth the name and no wood stacked to the ridgepole," he had said, "I will bury all 3 of you before thaw." He had been wrong. Not about the danger. The danger had been real as the blizzard that came on January 12th, as real as the cold that killed hundreds across the plains, as real as the stories of frozen bodies found within sight of shelter. He had been wrong about the boys, wrong about what they could build, wrong about what their father had already built, wrong about the door in the cliff that no one knew existed, the room carved by lamplight in secret, the refuge that had held 11 people through 5 days of wind, while the world above tried to kill them. On a spring morning, 120 years after Matthew Mercer began cutting stone, a child stood at the entrance to the shelter in the bluff. She was 7 years old, with her mother's eyes and her great-great-grandfather's stubbornness, and she had come to see the place her family had made famous. The door was open, weathered now, the grain visible through layers of protective treatment, and beyond it the passage curved into darkness. "Go ahead," her grandmother said. "It's safe." The child stepped inside. The walls were smooth, marked with chisel lines in neat rows. The ceiling was low. She could almost touch it if she stretched. The air was cool and still, the silence deep. She walked through the passage and into the main chamber. The hearth was cold. No fires burned here now, but the stones were blackened with a century of smoke, and the throat rose into darkness the way it had since Anton Krall helped shape it. On the floor, where generations of feet had passed, the stone was worn smooth. The child bent and touched it with her palm. The surface was cool and polished, shaped by time and use and the weight of everyone who had stood here before her. "Great-great-great-grandpa built this," she said. "He did. And it saved people. Many people, during the storm and after, because he taught others how to build their own." The child stood up and looked around the chamber, at the bunks carved into the wall, at the shelves where food had once been stored, at the hearth that had kept the room warm when the temperature outside dropped past 30 below zero. "I want to learn," she said. Her grandmother smiled. "Then we'll teach you." The house that saved them was the one no storm could see.